Hello everyone, this is Roland Wright here, and we're back again with another Exodus Set 6 guild reveal video. If you haven't seen the previous two guild reveals, go check those out before or after this one. Today we're going to be discussing the third guild shown in Magazine 4, an exciting and aggressive guild that I believe will be the first successful swarm deck or aggro deck in the game. If somehow the opening to this video didn't clue you in on what to expect, the third guild in Exodus Set 6 is Hellfires. The Hellfire guild is pretty interesting. It's a little bit more complicated than machines, but more straightforward than drifters. It's kind of familiar to Freeze and Afterthought in the sense that the mechanic is just there, and cards are trying to benefit from it. So let's talk about the mechanics, and that's plural because Hellfires utilize two new mechanics. It's worth noting that similar to machines, old Hellfires don't really benefit from this all that well. They kind of do, but not as much. The two new mechanics are called Ignite and Burst. Ignite is essentially a status condition that has really no other effects to it. A card is either considered ignited or not ignited. If a card has the Ignite keyword printed on it, it can ignite itself on summon. Specifically, it will ignite itself if the previous creature you've played that turn was of a different rarity. To give you the exact text, Ignite reads as, quote, "Ignite this creature when it enters play from your hand, if the last creature you put into play this turn was a Hellfire of a different rarity," end quote. That should be pretty simple and easy to understand. There's not much else to it on its own. It is worth noting though that you'll need to find some way to keep track of which creatures are ignited or not. I'm most likely going to personally buy some flame tokens from other games, but you can definitely use things like red dice, red checkers pieces, rotating a few degrees, etc. The second mechanic was Burst. All of these new Hellfire creatures come both with the Ignite keyword and the Burst keyword. A creature with the Burst keyword can activate a Burst, and the effect reads as, quote, "Destroy one of your ignited cards in play. The creature that bursts this turn deals extra damage equal to the number of ignited cards in play when it attacks for the rest of the turn." End quote. Keep in mind that this status effect lasts indefinitely. And very similar to Ignite, Burst is an activatable status effect. You can activate it at any time, paying the cost, which is another card that is currently ignited. By doing so, that creature is now considered to be bursting for the rest of the turn. Anytime it attacks, it deals bonus damage equal to the current number of ignited cards, and that's both you and your opponents. So be careful of mirror matches. And if somehow you're able to play cards that trigger an attack more than once, you benefit from that burst more than one time, although we haven't seen any new cards that'll do that. Ignite and Burst work in tandem to create a sort of combo chain play style. You have to play your creatures in a specific order. You have to attack with your creatures and burst in a specific order. And these orders can heavily change the outcome of your turn. And because of that, this is probably the most skill-intensive guild in the entire game. Your first time playing a match as Hellfire will likely be super messy. You're either going to take a tremendous amount of time on your turns, or you're going to fail at utilizing the Hellfire mechanics efficiently. The only way to overcome these obstacles is by playing numerous games and scenarios to memorize the orders that you need to take when playing or bursting your cards. We'll come back and talk about burst theory much later in this video, but first, let's start talking about these awesome cards. And we're shown quite a lot of them. Keep in mind that this is primarily a multi-rarity deck, similar to Machines, but unlike Machines, low-rarity Hellfires don't have abilities. They just come with Ignite and Burst. Our first creature is called Magma Mountain Lavasis. It's a rare Hellfire Mountain creature with the ability Infinite Furnace. It reads, quote, "When this creature enters play, you may add 1 Hellfire from your graveyard to your hand for each rarity you have in play." End quote. I think this creature is going to be seen in nearly all Hellfire decks. As we look at a card later on, we'll see that Hellfire will have a couple of deck types, most likely. Multi-rarity budget decks, multi-rarity expensive decks, and then all rare expensive decks. This card is pretty much used in all 3 of these. This card alone finally makes Swarm a reasonable strategy. It easily keeps your Hellfires constantly circulating the field, bursting and igniting as needed. Because bursting sacrifices a Hellfire, this card will almost always have a multitude of creatures to send back to hand. It's also critical to notice that it says for each rarity you have in play, meaning it checks your energy cards rarities as well, and symmetries. So when running this card, you definitely want to use common and uncommon energy. I also suspect that we may someday see secret rare energy, which would also synergize with this very nicely. And let's say you have 6 Hellfires in graveyard and a common and uncommon energy on your field. You can play this card, return 2 Hellfires and another Lavasis to your hand, and play the Lavasis again to gain another 3 Hellfires, essentially allowing you to double the amount of creatures you get back. It's super value, and I love it. The second creature we're going to look at is, well, interesting. It's called Vengeance Behemoth, and its name is super fitting. This is a rare Hellfire Behemoth creature with the ability Runes Alight. It reads, quote, "If you burst this turn, you may discard this card from hand to destroy 1 symmetry in play." End quote. Short and sweet, but super strong. I love this effect, and this is 100% the kind of tribal support we want to see. This card is so well balanced and so rightly faction specific that I'm just super impressed by Existence Games on this one. It also helps that the artwork is awesome. The main gist of this card is that it's a hand trick symmetry counter that can't be countered by other symmetries like Cove or the new Sands card. That's a huge deal. Cove Wars has been a massive part of every Exodus battle since Season 1, and this card completely shuts it down, similar to Forerunner. What's great about the design and tribal elements to this card is you can certainly run Cove and Sands in a deck with this, but if you need the space, those are probably some of the first cards to get yoinked out of the deck. Additionally, you really can't run this card with Forerunner because it's so dedicated to a Hellfire specific deck. That means that effect stockpiling is minimized more so, and we'll never really see this in a faction neutral beatdown situation like we usually see with powerful cards. Keep in mind that you can burst at any time to then play this card. At its worst, you can think of it as a card that says, sacrifice a creature and an energy to ... But even then, the creature that you burst to trigger this effect will have bonus attack damage, which on your opponent's turn isn't ideal since your creatures don't usually attack, but on your turn it does have some minor value. The most critical weakness to this card though is that you can't play it unless you have something that can trigger a burst. At bare minimum, that means you need one creature in play, or at least one energy. The creature can burst and sacrifice itself to then allow you to play this card. It's a great card, and it honestly might see play in all three of those deck types I mentioned earlier. The multi-rarity deck may cut this, but it depends on the other options for that deck. Levasis kind of fills in that rare slot, so I don't really know, but we'll definitely see. The third and final creature to talk about is a secret rare. It's called Burning Heartbeat Draza. It's a Hellfire creature with the ability Unfathomable Flames. It reads, quote, "This creature enters play ignited. While this creature is in play, ignore rarity requirements for igniting," end quote. Another short and sweet ability that I think is really strong. This card definitely sees play in both multi-rarity and rare-only decks, but it's primarily what causes them to be expensive and not budget-friendly. First off, the effect that causes it to enter play ignited is great. It means that this can be your flagship card for the turn. Usually, if you have 3 Hellfires in your hand, common, uncommon, and rare, the first creature you play just can't be ignited, and the second 2 cards you play will be. By playing Draza first, you can have all 3 cards be ignited instead. That's a nice bonus. But the true power comes from the fact that it can ignite if it's put into play from a graveyard. Normally, creatures can only ignite if they are played from hand, but Draza always ignites, no matter what. That's relevant when we look at the symmetries that are going to be supporting this guild. The second part of its effect is okay. It's primarily what enables a more beatdown-centric, rare-only Hellfire deck. I think with certain symmetries, that deck will be quite strong, but I can't say for certain which of the 2 types, multi-rarity or rare, will be stronger than the other. They both look legitimately strong and fun to play. Multi-rarity is more swarm and aggro oriented, while rare only is the more normal beatdown control oriented kind of deck with some swarm elements. The best part about Draza is that it's not mandatory. At least I don't really feel like it is. You can certainly make a budget multi-rarity deck, and maybe even rare only deck, and be competitive with only a slight disadvantage when compared to someone who has Draza. And I think that's a pretty good place to be for a secret rare. So those are the awesome creatures that we have to talk about for now. I really like all of them, and this is definitely a guild that cares a lot about its creatures. Both Machines and Hellfires are more creature focused than other guilds, as they strongly define the mechanics at play, and I think that's a great sign for the game. Symmetries have been a huge part of Exodus up until now, with most decks running 2 symmetries for every 1 creature. I think for Hellfire that will definitely not be the case, and that's large in part due to Levasis, but also a few of the symmetries that we're about to take a look at. So let's start with the first one. Our first symmetry is a common called Scarlet Drift Heights. It has the effect that reads, quote, "When this card is played, ignite it. It stays in play until the end of the turn. Draw 1 energy." This card, of course, is not very impressive, but it doesn't really need to be. This is a common symmetry, and I think it fits that role quite well. This card has 2 effects, and in some ways can be read as deal 1+ damage, draw 1 energy. Trading a main deck card for an energy is pretty much always a bad trade. Main deck cards are valued higher than energy cards are, but when you consider the damage boost that this might provide your Hellfires due to it being ignited, it's not that bad. If you have 3 ignited Hellfires on a pile of 1 each, the highest amount of damage you can do with them is 5 damage. By playing this card, you increase that damage from 5 to 8. That's pretty darn good value. There's also an argument that bonus energy is more important to Hellfires due to their swarmy nature and the constant bursting of their creatures. So overall, I think this is a fine card. I'm expecting it to not see that much high-tier competitive play. It really does depend on all the other possible new symmetries that might take its place, but this is definitely a viable budget build option as we've seen with most of Hellfire. Now let's talk about the second symmetry. This is an uncommon called Crossfire formula. Its effect reads, quote, "When this card is played, ignite it. It remains on the field until the end of the turn. When you ignite a card, you may summon a Hellfire from your hand or graveyard on an existing blank pile on your field." End quote. Okay, so this card is really important. There's a lot to break down here with several angles and deck builds that'll make use of this card. So let's discuss each of them one at a time. But first, I do want to mention that I'm a little confused as to why this card says it remains on the field instead of it stays in play like the other symmetries do. It also says blank pile on your field instead of blank pile of energy, which half of the cards in Exodus use one and the other half use the other. For all the praise that I'll give Existence Games for this set, these wording inconsistencies are a little surprising to see this late in the game, and probably won't be the last. But that aside, let's talk about Crossfire. This is probably one of the most successful combo cards in the game. It's really well balanced all around. First off, we got that ignite effect. As we already just discussed with the previous card, having an ignited symmetry in play can end up yielding loads of bonus damage for your Hellfires. But then there's the recursion swarm effect, similar to Levasis. Now once again, I need to remind you that the default ignite keyword requires the creature be played from hand in order to ignite. So playing creatures from your graveyard won't keep this combo chain going indefinitely, which is why I think a great use to this card is to play it followed by one of the four outcomes. Outcome 1, you ignite something else, which lets you bring Draza out of the graveyard. He automatically ignites, which means you can pull another card from graveyard. Outcome 2, you play another symmetry that ignites, which will in turn let you bring out creatures from your grave. Outcome 3, you just play creatures from your hand to simultaneously play creatures from grave. An example being, you play 2 creatures from your hand that ignite, thus allowing 2 creatures from your grave to come in. And outcome 4, you can use this card to get Levasis back into play from grave. He returns a bunch of Hellfires from grave to hand, and now you can summon them as normal, which allows them to ignite and maybe pull even more Hellfires out of grave. And honestly, I think this is one of the best outcomes you can have, besides utilizing Draza in some way. All in all, you can quite literally have a massive explosion of a turn with this card. Getting your entire grave into play with just 1 or 2 cards initially is pretty darn strong. But the biggest weakness with this card is going to be maintaining enough blank piles of energy to actually capitalize on the chain summons. Now, unfortunately, there aren't really any good energy generation cards in Exodus for this kind of playstyle. By that I mean a card that generates multiple piles of one instead of buffing a singular pile or buffing existing piles. I do think, however, that it's worth noting Flashfire Nebulous Haze has some synergy here, since this card can summon it from grave, which will cause Flashfire to generate a new pile of energy, which you can use to call in another Flashfire or whatever else. The downside there is that Flashfire doesn't have a natural way to ignite. I'm not sure if this card is a staple. It really depends on the consistency at which you can pull off such big turns, and if they're even worth it. Plus, there's still the energy generation problem at hand. Regardless, I think it's still a great card, even if it pulls one creature out of grave. Ideally Draza or Levasis. Alright, let's talk about a rare symmetry, Hellfire and Brimstone. This card has the effect, quote, "When this card is played, ignite it. It leaves play when a symmetry is revealed from your main deck. When you successfully summon or put into play a Hellfire, ignite it. Then reveal the top card of your main deck. If it was a Hellfire, draw it." End quote. Another card with a lot to unpack. As I'm sure you've noticed, all three of these symmetries ignite when they're put into play, which is awesome and thematic. Once again, they're also all tribal specific to Hellfires, so no worries of them finding their way into some gross, non-Hellfire beatdown deck. This card is pretty good. I think it's best with Crossfire formula, as it allows those creatures coming out of grave to be ignited. And you can use that to then draw a Hellfire, which you can play to trigger Crossfire and this card again. And a loop keeps going until you hit a symmetry with this card. I think for the most part, you'll see Crossfire, Brimstone, and the fourth symmetry we're going to look at all in decks together and rarely apart. They all synergize really nicely with one another, and I think their yields are pretty solid. It's fairly safe to say that Hellfire decks will likely be running 8 to 10 creatures if it's the multi-rarity variant, possibly even more. It really depends on the unrevealed cards. And I don't have much else to really add here. I think it's a fairly automated effect, and I don't think you run this unless you're planning on running the other cards that specifically really want to go with it. Which brings us to the final symmetry shown for Hellfires, called Atlas Ablaze. This is a rare symmetry with the effect that reads, quote, "This card is considered a creature when it is revealed. When this card is played, take 1 energy from your energy deck and use it to start a new pile. Target one of your creatures in play. For each rarity star it has below 3, that new pile gains 1 energy." End quote. So first off, this card has an effect we haven't really seen before, which is that it's considered a creature when revealed. If you're curious, that doesn't actually have any weird interactions with existing cards. But it does synergize with some reveal cards, namely Glistening Undergrove and to a lesser extent Ethereal Aurealis and Hidden Haven. The primary reason this card even has that effect is for the benefit of Hellfire and Brimstone, which is why I mentioned that I think you run 2 copies of this, 2 of Brimstone, and 2 of Crossfire formula all together. This card makes it harder for Brimstone to miss and destroy itself, but I don't really see any other great synergies with Hellfire, and so I have a couple of gripes with this card. It's straight up an upgrade to Invoke in every single way. You have no reason not to run this card over Invoke, now and pretty much forever. It's faction generic, but specifically benefits from low or multi-rarity decks, which is okay-ish. It doesn't bother me that much. But the main thing that does bother me though is that Hellfires want swarms of energy. They don't really want one big pile. It's much easier to deliberately create a big pile as needed, like if you want to ensure you get Lavos' effect or something, but much harder to split that energy up for a board swarm. I wish this card was something like start a pile of energy for each rarity star under 3, instead of what it currently is. Hellfire and Machine will likely use this card since they have common creatures, so this card is essentially a free 3 energy for them. But I think Hellfire and Brimstone decks will want it the most. It's a cool card and I do like it. I think it's fun and interesting. But yeah, it being faction neutral and not building multiple piles is kind of a bummer here. And that's it, folks. Another guild down. I'm definitely excited for Hellfires. They have a lot of gorgeous artwork and a pretty think-heavy mechanic that seems to be really rewarding when done right. I also do want to at some point take the time to dedicate a video to talking about burstology, or rather the study of when and how to properly burst your Hellfires. As I mentioned earlier in this video, experience, practice, and memory will all play a huge part in your effectiveness and speed when playing a Hellfire deck. You'll need to commit to memory various different board states so you can quickly decide which cards to burst and not to burst, in what order. I think a different video though is definitely needed. This video has become much longer than intended, and so I'll put together something more comprehensive later. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope it explained everything that Hellfires are going to be bringing to the game. And I'll see you guys next time. This has been Roland Wright. Have a good one.